Once again, welcome to this final lecture in Principles of Manager for Management for this semester. I managed to botch the title once again. So for today, we have a fairly brief lecture. We're going to be discussing some more incentive schemes, particularly concerning high wages, but first models in which we share the risk. Okay. We've seen these topics last class. So last class we looked at promotion, at what we call promotion tournaments, as a potential way to solve agency problems in terms, particularly in situations in which the performance measurement of an employee is fuzzy, is difficult to observe, and also in situations in which we cannot completely rely on absolute performance measures or result-based measures, because there may be a downturn in the economy. So even if an employee is trying its best, his or her best, the performance outcomes may be bad. So we saw here that promotion tournaments were a good solution for those kinds of conundrums. Today, I want to talk about risk sharing. So a very important notion in some entrepreneurship models, but I think I can generalize in entrepreneurship itself, is the notion of risk and how risk affects different economic entities or agents differently. One thing we can generally say is that individuals tend to dislike risk. Organizations, on the other hand, tend to be, they don't like risk, but they tend to feel neutral, to be able to deal with risk. And at least you can theoretically conceive, and perhaps you know someone that actually likes risk. They prefer to take a gamble and have the chance of losing than taking the same amount in cash right now. So some people are just like that, even though we know they tend to be on the minority. So this gives rise to what is generally called three different types of preferences towards risk. So we are looking at risk as any other good or service, and it's something we derive, well, most of us tend not to derive utility from risk. We tend to derive a disutility from risk. So individuals like you and I tend to, everything else equal, want to have as little risk in their lives as possible. And the good thing about risk, and particularly in the time I'm recording this, there's an important distinction to be made. And that distinction is the distinction between risk and uncertainty. So the good thing about risk is we can, to a certain extent, mitigate risk. That is, reduce risk. So we can we can draw and take actions in order to reduce risk. We cannot, however, do anything about uncertainty. Uncertainty is concerning the future, is unknowable, and we cannot act upon it. If we can act upon the source of unknowns, these unknowns are risk. If we cannot prepare towards that, this is not risk, this is uncertainty. So we can do our best to mitigate, or even in certain cases to practically eliminate risk, but it's extremely difficult, or I would say practically impossible to do anything that will change uncertainty regarding the future. So knowing that, and knowing that risk is therefore a good that rather than a good and economic bad, that we can incorporate in our preferences or try to keep away from our consumption, we tend to define risk attitudes in three very large broad categories. These tend to be the category that we call risk aversion, which is the one I'm going to be referring to in these slides. Oops, well, again, I had to reinstall to reinstall my operating system, and my pointer isn't working. Perhaps I can use the pointer from the mouse. Yes, but it's not exactly what I mean. on a pen. Okay. We can have risk aversion. This is from generally associated with individuals. With risk aversion, what we have is, say, given the choice between a gamble and a certain equivalent of the same value as of the same expected value as the gamble, most of us will prefer the certain equivalent. And more than that, most of us are even willing to take a little bit less in terms of certain equivalent than the expected value, of the gamble. Let me exemplify. A risk-averse agent is one that is willing to take 49 euros for sure, 49 euros for sure, rather than gambling whether to gain 0 euros with a flip coin or 100 euros with a flip coin. That is, earning an expected 50 euros with this flip coin. So the chances of flipping heads or tails are 50% each. The expected value in this gamble, either 0 or 100, is 50 euros. So I'll try to draw it. So you have 100 euros. Let me make dollars because it's easier to draw, or 0, each with 50% chance. So 0.5. So if you are risk averse, you rather take 49 euros for sure with 100% certainty than to play this game that yields you a greater expected value, but that expected value is not for sure. Risk neutral agents, such as companies, particularly large companies, tend to be indifferent between gambling, taking this gamble I showed you, or even receiving 50 euros for sure. So a large organization in particular is completely indifferent, cannot tell which one is best. It's like a tantalizing decision for the company to decide between taking a gamble to get 100 with 50% chance or 0 with 50% chance, or just receiving 50 with 100% chance. This is the example of a risk neutral agent. Finally, you can have what we call a risk-seeking agent, sometimes wrongfully called a risk lover agent. I don't know where the risk lover part came from, but I've never seen it in a textbook, even though it's sometimes used. But a risk-seeking agent, I was almost saying lover, a risk-seeking agent is one that prefers to take this gamble right here, 100 with 50% chance or 0 with 50% chance. They prefer to take this gamble rather than receiving 51 euros or dollars for sure. So the risk seeking prefers to take a gamble with a lower expected value rather than a higher certainty equivalent. Notice that higher here means 51, 55, means 99, doesn't mean 110, okay, or even 101. So that's what a risk-seeking agent, that's how a risk-seeking agent behaves, okay? So knowing these three differences, we can now talk about situations for risk-averse agents, in this case, risk-averse individuals. So these two risk-averse agents, they are homeowners, and each had the, well, with the benefit of hindsight, poor decision of making wood frame houses. And these houses have a risk. They are worth $200,000 each. So each of the house is worth $2,000. And the poor decision in hindsight that I was referring to is that because they are made of wood, they have a chance to be destroyed by fire. Okay, it's a fairly small chance. It's a 10, or actually not that fairly small. It's a high. I wouldn't take 10% chance of my house being destroyed by fire, perhaps with me in it. So, but let's say it's a minority chance, and there's a 90% chance that the house doesn't break down. So if the house breaks down, you have to pay the 200,000 euros that you value for it to rebuild it. So this contractor really knows your willingness to pay. He's completely taking away all your consumer surplus. So this guy is taking $200,000, which is how much you value the house. So the expected value for you to rebuild the house is, well, really there are only two options. Either the house burns down or doesn't burn down. If it burns down, you lose 200K. Sorry about this, I'm doing this with my mouse. If not, you, well, don't lose anything. Okay, so this is if it doesn't burn. So the expected value you get from this for the cost of rebuilding is $20,000. Okay. So let's see how risk sharing works. In risk sharing, now the two owners they come together and they create a cooperative. And this cooperative spreads the costs in case of an accident, in case of a fire. If either home burns down, the two will split the costs evenly. Okay, so what this means is that if either my house or your house breaks down, we split the costs together. So if my house burns down and yours doesn't, let's assume the probabilities of the two catching fire are independent, are possible but independent. If either house burns down, we help each other out. So if my house burns down and yours doesn't, I put in 100,000 and you help me with 100,000. So you show some solidarity towards me, but it's reverse solidarity as well. If my house is fine and yours burned down, each of us pitches in 100,000. If both houses burn down, each will have to put the 200,000. Okay. So with this situation, we are maintaining the expected value. I'll show that in a little bit, but you have the calculations here already, while reducing the variance in half. Okay, let me demonstrate graphically. So the possibilities now are whether the house of each owner doesn't burn. So if it burns with a probability of 0.1, it doesn't burn with a probability of 0.9. And the house of the other owner also has the same possibilities, either burning down or not burning down. This with the probability of 0.1, this with the probability of 0.9. Same thing goes here. So if my house doesn't burn down, my neighbor's house may also not burn down. That also has a probability of 0.9. In fact, these two have a probability of 0.9 times 0.9, 0.81. But I may be lucky, but with a 10% chance, actually with 0.09 chance. Oops, this was not to. How do I erase? Eraser. Okay, good. My house may not break down, but my neighbor's house may. I said break, but I meant burn down. If both houses burn down, so I'm telling you here the payoffs for an individual. If both houses burn down, there's not much to be done about it. So I will have to put in 200,000. If my house burns but my neighbor's doesn't, I only need to pitch in. This is a 2, by the way. I only have to pitch in 100,000. The other 100 my neighbor is pitching in. If my house doesn't burn down but my neighbor's burns, I have to pitch in 100 to help him, even though I'm fine. I'm showing solidarity towards him. If neither house burns down, this is the best case scenario. Well, I don't have to spend anything. So if we just calculate the expected value here, you can do that with your calculator. I have mine right here. You cannot see it, but so this is 0.1 times 0.1, or 0.1 squared times 200k, plus 0.1 times 0.9 times 100k, plus 0.9 times 0.1 times 100k, plus 0.9 times 0.9 times 0. So that should yield the expected value here is, as we saw in the previous slide, $20,000. So the good news with risk sharing is that the expected value for the reconstruction is the same. However, the good news is that the variance is reduced. I'm not going to calculate the variance here. It's that high school formula, you know, of subtracting each to the average square. But we can even intuitively already see that. While before you had to, even forgetting probabilities, whilst before you had to pay the 200,000 in, well, half the scenarios, in this case, you only have to pay the 200,000 in one scenario. Yes, there are more scenarios in which you are paying. You are paying in 3/4 rather than in 1/2 of the scenarios, but you are paying less in many of them. Okay, so from a variance perspective, what we are doing is we are reducing the variance of how much we have to pay. So because we tend to be risk averse, we tend to want to avoid risk, this is a preferable solution. If, on the other hand, we are, say, a company, an agent that is risk neutral, we will in fact be indifferent between taking this risk sharing scheme or simply just acting by ourselves, because the expected value from the previous scenario, whether in which you either your house burns down or doesn't with a 10% versus 90% probability, you have the same expected value, but much greater variance. In fact, the same variance. Okay, $360,000 variance. In this scenario, we only have $180,000 variance. Because of that, we tend to prefer, as individuals that are risk averse, to take risk sharing schemes. Okay. If you want to look at this in a statistical manner, the risk-averse individuals take into account more information than risk-neutral. Why? Because risk-averse agents take into account information regarding the variance of the payoffs, while risk-neutral agents do not even look at the variance of the payoffs. Okay? So I'm about done in terms of time I have for this first part of the lecture. So what I will do is I'll stop the recording here and then take the second part to talk about high wages and their impact on productivity. Okay, so see you in a bit. So welcome back to the second part of the video. I took a short break. So just to summarize, risk sharing and risk preferences. So the previous example of the houses breaking down would impact differently on agents with different attitudes towards risk. The case of individuals that are risk averse, as most individuals are, what we're going to see on Thursday is that sometimes these individuals don't behave as risk averse agents, particularly those that turn out to be entrepreneurs. But if these individuals are risk averse, they will prefer a scheme in which they share the risks. In this case, the expected value was exactly the same, so they would clearly prefer the risk-sharing scheme. We could conceive, depending on their risk preferences, a scheme in which they would even prefer risk-sharing, even if their expected value they would have to pay would be slightly slightly larger. That would depend on their attitudes towards risk, on how much of an economic bad risk was to their utility functions on that point. but that is outside the scope of this course. I just want you to understand this notion. So risk averse individuals would prefer the risk sharing scheme I showed you before, even with the same expected value. Risk neutral agents like companies, particularly large organizations, would be indifferent. They wouldn't know how to choose between not sharing risk and sharing risk, like in the example we saw. For the risk-seeking agents, in the previous example, they would prefer the first scenario. Why? Because the variance was greater. So a risk-seeking agent will prefer the scenario with the greater variance. This is a good way to explain, even though there are more factors at play here, to explain how job contracts many times work. It's an interesting analogy we can make here. Most employees working for a company have, if not an exclusively fixed salary, they have a mostly fixed salary. Last week we saw a simple scheme to ensure effort by employees to align the objective of employees and owners of the company to solve the principal agent problem, in other words, and that the way we solved that was by introducing a variable component in that example, a commissions based a sales commission on as part of the salary of our employee. However, we know in practice that most employees dislike to have their wage mostly made out of a variable component, and we explored some reasons for that already last week. We said, well, that can be seen as unfair, particularly during an economic downturn, because then an employee may be working as much as she can and still not being able to sell. So it doesn't depend on the level of effort. It depends on an exogenous factor from our organization, such as the state of the industry or the state of the economy, the general economy as a whole. So that is a factor. There's another factor, which is because most employees tend to be risk averse. Most employees tend to be risk averse because they are persons, they are not organizations. They will many times prefer to earn less, but for sure, than to earn more, potentially more, or I can even say on average earn more. But this average means that sometimes they may earn a lot and sometimes they may earn not at all or very little. Okay, so because most of us tend to be risk averse, we tend to prefer to earn a smaller certain wage than a larger uncertain, or riskier, I should rather say, larger riskier salary. Okay, this is again many times used as a justification for, say, the differences between the incomes of employees and owners of companies or entrepreneurs, which also relates to a very interesting question some students have previously, or one student has previously posed. So one reason that sometimes is given for for owners of companies to earn so much more, sometimes owners, managers, to earn so much more than regular employees, is because the actions and the decisions made by these owners are riskier. So they can risk losing a lot of money if they make a bad investment call, while an employee, generally speaking, always earns the same wage, whether it's a sunny day outside or whether it is a rainy day outside. As you can see, this justification has its limits. What happens then when, say, an employee is fired, or is put on layoff, as we are currently seeing? That doesn't mean you're earning the same wage. If you're fired, you're not earning at all. You're collecting an employment benefit, if that exists. If you're put on layoff, you're not receiving the same as well. You're receiving a fraction of what you were earning before. So this explanation is not without its faults, but it helps us a little bit to see more clearly this distinction between risk preferences. So many employees prefer to earn a smaller certain equivalent rather than this certain or certainty equivalent, rather than doing the gamble of being extremely well paid in good times and risking earning nothing in bad times. Okay, so I have some coffee left. And finally, I want to conclude with a topic I already discussed a little bit last lecture, which is efficiency wages. I said finally, but I actually also want to talk about teams after this. So a firm can motivate its workers, its employees, by threatening to fire them, saying, if you show up late more than 3 times in a month, you are given a warning. If this happens over 3 consecutive months, we fire you. So we are supervising, we are overseeing your punctuality, your ability to arrive at your job at the time input in the contract, explicitly written down in the contract. We are imposing a sanction in case you fail to live up to this contract clause. If you cannot mend your ways, so first time there's a warning, but if you cannot mend your ways, we can fire you. And when you're fired, you earn 0. So this is a way to oversee an employee's performance based upon a threat, sometimes implicit, many times extremely explicit. Do it just once more, and you're out of the game. We can think of different ways in order to motivate our employees. Such as saying there's a prospect for promotion, so you never fire anyone, but those that that repeatedly arrive on time, that repeatedly put on their best efforts, they are promoted, so they earn more. And the chances of being promoted and how much more you will earn are enticing enough to make you always arrive on time. So this is, again, ensuring your effort, not via a threat, not via a punishment or what many times labor economists call a stick, but instead via a carrot, by making sure that you are well treated if you behave well. If you look at this analogy I was just referring, you will quickly understand how labor economists understand or look at employees. As I was mentioning, the efficiency wages approach, however, is based, as interesting as it may sound, is based on this threatening perspective. So the threat to fire someone. So how do efficiency wages work? Well, if you remember what I previously said, efficiency wages mean you're paying higher than average wages to your employees. So say for a certain role, responsibility, seniority, and experience, the average wage is, say, 2,000 euros net. Your company pays 2,500, pays a 500 premium on the same wage, on the same employee with the same characteristics, with all the same characteristics, the same experience, the same performance, the same prior results, the same education level, the same everything. So it just happened to pay more. So because you're paying more than what other companies do, you will have better. Okay, that's a good question. So a colleague is asking, what does shirking mean? Shirking means being lazy. So to shirk is being lazy. If you are caught shirking, you are caught being lazy. So as I was referring to here, because your company is paying more than everyone else, there are 2 associated advantages. First is you are more easily able to hire the best employees for that task, because you're paying more, you'll be able to attract the bad employees, the medium employees, but also the very best employees. If you are paying what other companies pay on average, you'll be attracting the the worse than average, the average ones, but it's going to be very difficult for you to hire the better than average. And if you are paying less than average, then well, you are only going to be able to attract those employees that likely are worse than average. So the fact that you are already paying better than average for the same job means that you have the if you want the freedom, the liberty to hire employees that otherwise wouldn't even apply for your job. The second advantage of paying higher than average wages, that is, of paying efficiency wages, is that because you are paying more than others, you are a very, very desirable employer. So this means that if you have to fire an employee because they're not performing as expected, you will not have a very hard time getting a substitute, finding a substitute for that person. And you know that, but most importantly, your employees, your current employees also know that. So you just landed your dream job. The responsibilities are what you want. The pay is great. And with pay here, we can include any kind of fringe benefits, from company car to, say, more days off to complementary gym, etc. So anything that people value in terms of compensation. So we call these efficiency wages, but we can include really any type of compensation. Because your employees know that what you are offering is better than average and sometimes even unique, your employees will be very, very, very careful before shirking, before showing up late, before not turning in a report they're asked to, before not really putting as much effort into a deal as they should have, not being as diligent as they should have been in the first place. So there is a very implicit threat associated here, which is we the employer, are being extremely generous towards you. So it will not be very difficult for us, the employer, to find someone else to do your job at the same wage. Hell, perhaps it won't even be difficult in this economy to find someone to do your job for less than what you're earning. So the cost of shirking, the cost of being lazy in this scenario is very high, because you will not be able to get the same wage elsewhere if you lose this job. Okay. So yes, this is basically what I want to do. So what I wanted to mention here: firms are increasing the cost of shirking by raising wages, in comparison to what other companies do. Okay. Any questions here? Very well. So in a more formal way, we call an efficiency wage a wage that is high enough to motivate effort. So a good question. So smaller firms that tend to be more financially constrained, should they pay higher wages in the sense that they may not have such large profits? Yes, this may happen for reputational reasons. So I'll give you an example that many times Nova graduates, former students have to face. So you just finished your undergraduate degree, and you finished with let's say a very high GPA. You finished with a GPA of 17 out of 20 values. So great GPA under any measure you can conceive of, and you are given 2 job offers instantly. You haven't even finished the 3rd year, you're already given these 2 job offers. One is at a very large, let's assume your dream area to work on is what can I say? We were talking about marketing. Let's say it's marketing. One is an offer from a leading international or multinational ad agency, like McCann Erickson, for example. The other is from a small Lisbon-based or Porto-based agency. The small agency in order for them to be competitive, they are the most likely to pay you better. To pay you why? Because they know, or if let me put it in a different way, the large multinational organization knows that for you to have in your CV uh, uh, some seniority at such a well reputed agency, say you spend 3 or 4 years there, that is a good line you should add on your CV. It's a company that has been known to select the best, that has uh, great on-the-job training schemes, that produces some of the best and the most charismatic ad campaigns in recent history. So it needs no introduction, because they are lending you part of that recognition themselves. They can afford to pay you less than a smaller, lesser known agency. And this applies for companies in different industries, irrespective of the industries. So many times you will see this type of competition, particularly if you are a talented or a promising professional. So if not a talented professional already, you are a promising professional because you had, say, good grades in your degree, and you had some interesting internships. Okay, so even if the smaller company is making less money, so they have lower profits, it does still pay off. In fact, it's the only way they can do in order to ensure they can hire these better employees that are also more productive. Okay, so but that's a good question. So as I was mentioning here, for efficiency wages, the implicit threat is that well, many people are willing to do your job if you shirk. So the company can say, I can just start a hiring campaign tomorrow, and I will have people going around the block begging me to interview them because we just pay so well, we offer so many opportunities and such nice fringe benefits. So I think this is what I wanted to refer here. Just to mention the other side of the coin. Yes, being fired means taking a less attractive job, and because you do not want to do that, again, you avoid shirking. So that's how efficiency wages work in practice. Okay. So let me then talk a little bit about incentives in teams. And this is an interesting part. Again, has a strong connection to human resource management. So during the course of this semester, you have been divided in groups, in teams, that you did not choose, that only had one thing in common. Actually, we make sure you had two things in common. One was that you were going to the same practical session, of course. The other was that you didn't have many things in common. So we wanted to create some diversity in the groups of students we made. Then we had to make some compromises, but mostly we tend to be able to achieve that. We generally don't want the groups to be very large. The groups have to work for a common goal. And the evaluation you get from your group reports, from your financial strategy and marketing report, these evaluations are group-wide evaluations. So we do not discriminate based on who worked hardest. We just give a grade to the group. So part of your grade is individual, the one from the midterm and the one from the final exam. The other one is a group grade. And I strongly incentivize this in all the courses I teach. I know of some professors that, for example, even within groups, they will give different grades to students when they are presenting, doing the final presentation. I never do that because I want to incentivize teams to work as a whole. And as we saw, based on the promotion tournament part, we may be putting in place, without intending to, bad incentives when we say, yes, but we will give an individual evaluation based on how well you present. This may mean that you want to make the best in your presentation. That may not necessarily be what's best for the group. You may want to outshine your colleagues, for example. So we try to avoid that as possible. However, there are some troubles when measuring performance at the level of the team. But let's first start with individual level. When the performance is measured at individual level, there is little incentive for employees to combine and to work together for the benefit of the company as a whole. The team, but the company as a whole. You want to maximize your own outcomes. So sometimes you can see these competitions we were talking about, or I was talking about in terms of promotions, for example. When we have teams, we have a group of people that are incentivized to share information. Say you are doing your financial report, if you think back a little bit. I'm guessing most of you divided your work a little bit. So some would have to do perhaps the first part of the report, the more accounting part, some the second part, the more investment analysis part. Even then, maybe some had more the tasks of running the Excel sheets. Some others perhaps have the tasks of doing the writing. Some people, or one at least, should reread everything by the end to see if there are not incongruencies or inconsistencies, or even too much redundancy, people just repeating themselves in the 3 pages you have. I know it's too little, but in the 3 pages you have to answer the questions. So the element of analysis of the team allows you to specialize, but also incentivizes you to share, because many of the activities you do will have precedences. You'll only be able to write down the text after your colleague has run down the numbers. And before they can run the numbers, someone will have to gather the data. So teams are incentivized to share and to work for the same goal together. Let's consider the action, that any action has these 2 properties. So let's consider the total benefits to a team from a given action is greater than the total cost of that action. Okay, so let's also consider that the total cost of a given action is 1 divided by the number of team members times the total benefit to the team as a whole derived from this action. So actions that have the first property, the total benefit from the team is greater than the total cost, are value creating because the total benefit is greater than the total cost. Say, for example, let me give you an example. Someone has to organize on an Excel sheet the data from Sabi. That organization is a cost, but the benefit derived from there will serve to answer many questions. So you have a cost that is lesser than the benefit you derive from that action. So this is a value creating action. However, since the individual undertaking the action compares this cost to the personal benefits, actions with property number 2 may not be undertaken. Now let's consider the following action. At the end of the assignment, one of you is put in charge to reread everything, and try to find any redundancies, any mistakes, any inconsistencies. This is a cost that you have alone, and the benefit for the team is big, but the benefit for you yourself may not be so big because you're only part of the team. In other words, if you do not really do the revision work for your assignment, the assignment is still delivered, and rather than getting a 17, you get a 15 because some inconsistencies are found. Yes, you do get a 15, so you do not get your best possible grade, but at least you didn't also put the effort. You get a grade that was the result of someone else's effort. This effect I'm mentioning right now is what we call the free rider problem. This free rider problem, as I'm about to show you, tends to be more common in larger teams and teams in which the monitoring of the responsibilities is not so clear. So if it's not well defined who does what, there may be some people that do very little. if there are many individuals or, in a given team, because the amount of effort each has to put is the same, but the overall outcomes are outcomes for the team as a whole, it's easier for you to shirk, to just be on the email exchange or on the WhatsApp group and just say, I'm fine with that, yes, or better than that, not even say anything. That is shirking and suffering no consequences from that. If the team, however, is small, the responsibilities tend to be clear, and it tends to be very clear when someone is shirking. If there's only 3 of us, it's fairly easy to monitor who is doing what. So smaller teams allow for better monitoring and also facilitate the sanctioning of free riders. Okay. Why? Because the outcomes are the same. This means if you don't work enough, we'll just say either kick you out of the team because you're easy to identify, or put a bigger workload on you next time. Firms also can stimulate or can try to fight free riding and stimulate cooperation by allowing employees to work together for longer periods. The advantage here is because if you say you free ride on the principles of management finance report, but then you have the same team for the strategy report and then for the marketing report. Because of that, if you free ride on the finance report, then you're going to meet the same people that you cheated on the next report, and they will not be happy with that. So these longer cooperation periods will be more likely to induce effort, because there will be the possibility to punish those that are lazy today in the future. You can do this through peer pressure, social isolation, or simply the refusal to help the person. Okay, so a colleague was lazy, didn't do his job in the first report. Perhaps you're going to control this person, you're going to control him more closely. Perhaps you'll stop inviting him for parties because you developed a dislike for this person over time. Or if this person is in need, say needs some notes from class because they got sick and they couldn't come to class, well, you can simply be mean, do a tit for tat strategy. You were lazy now, you didn't give us the outcome now previously, so now I'm going to treat you in the same way. Okay, so these are the ways we tend to solve this free riding problem: having smaller teams and having teams that collaborate over a longer period of time, so that they have an active incentive to be nice to each other, because as everyone know, karma is something I cannot say on a YouTube video. So firms can promote repeated interactions by keeping teams together for a long time. This is a good solution. However, there's still a small issue here, which is teams that work together for a very, very long time may also develop other behaviors, such as and this is already a little bit the domain of organizational psychology, but this can lead these individuals to say manage their performance, so none of them is working too hard and they will work cohesively to say that. So imagine you have the same groups for every assignment until the end of your undergraduate degree. Because this is always the same groups, you may develop, say, the ability to tell your professors that, well, we're having too much trouble with other assignments, so why don't you postpone? And everyone will agree with that because you're working together for a very long time. So this may provide some incentives to reduce the level of effort of the team as a whole. But it solves the free riding problem, and that's what we are concerned here today. Anyway, any questions regarding this free riding or the efficiency wage problems? Nothing for the time being. So what I'll do now is I'll stop the recording. I'll be in the chat for some 5 minutes more, and then I'll have an office hour meeting. If you want, you can also send me an email for that. Okay. If not, see you on Thursday. I'll be talking about entrepreneurship and answering some questions you may have that you may be curious about. Okay. Bye bye.